So I'm about to do a refret on this 70s Guild arch top that a customer brought me. Real neat looking guitar. One thing I noticed right away is just how narrow this neck is. I measured it, it's like 55 millimeters right here, and normally that's like at least 56, so that's really narrow. Just a interesting little tidbit about it, but just thought I'd take the time to show how to do a refret tutorial. This is a good one to show it on because it's got binding and it's an ebony board, and I'm taking out larger frets and putting in smaller EVO gold frets, so there's no hiding my mistakes. If it chips out and I don't fix it properly, you're gonna see it. I can't depend on the frets to cover up the little chips out you get with ebony. I gotta be real careful. And the radius on here also, I measured. Let's see if I can do this one-handed. 9.5 is wobbling back and forth a little bit, so that means it's rounder than 9.5. But then when I check the 7.25, there's a big old gap underneath in the middle. So it's just somewhere between 7.25 and 9.5. I don't have a 7.25 radius beam, but I have a 9.5 inch radius beam, so this is going to be a 9.5 inch radius. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is take my soldering iron. I'm going to hold it to the fret and just hold it there for a little bit. Some people like to put solder across the top of the fret. My opinion, that doesn't really make any difference, but the argument is that putting that solder on there helps transfer the heat, but I don't find the solder to be necessary. Usually don't have a problem just using the heat. And this is just to loosen up any glue that's holding the fret in. It also kind of just makes the wood fibers a little more malleable, so that when I pull the fret out, it's less likely to take some of the wood with it. Sometimes these frets are installed poorly and they just pile in the glue. It's a real mess to get out, but we're about to find out how easy these come out. So I do this really slow, especially since this is ebony. Like I said, ebony's really chippy. Looks like we might be lucky here though. Oh, yep, it's chipping out. See right there? I don't know if the camera can really see that, but it's starting to lift up those wood fibers. So one thing I like to do to really make sure that those don't come up is I just come in here with my X-Acto knife and just cut those fibers. And where it's lifting up right here, I can do that. And I'm not cutting down into the wood. I'm going in here and the blade is against the tang of the fret, and I'm just slicing away from it. So any wood that's clinging onto there, this just severs it right off so that it stops pulling. I'll give it a little more heat now because it's probably cooled off in the time it took to do that.
That should be good.
Boom. First fret out, just like that. And we got a couple little spots where it lifted, but honestly I really can't complain with that. That's pretty good. And then I like to take a flat block of some sort, preferably a wooden one. Yeah, small wooden block. This is a little big, but I like to just push down on those, and that just pushes those fibers back in so that they don't pop up again. And then once I do that, I take a little bit of the thin CA glue and just go over that, and that just re-solidifies any little chips. And the fretboard's gonna get leveled later anyway, so I'm not worried about making a mess with that. I'll do the next one now too. And this one, same thing, just holding the heat on the fret, loosening up any of that glue that's in there. Now some other people might have some other sort of trick that they tell you while they do this. There's 100 different ways to do this. I've seen people, like I said, I've seen people do this with solder. Some people don't use any heat, and I think those people are crazy. Again, get under there. And that one's starting to lift again. Sometimes you can also just get in here with these, and that will cut the wood fibers. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, but I can see that piece isn't lifting anymore. Now that, if I were to just keep pulling, that's gonna tear out really bad right there. I can see where it's already starting to lift. So I'm gonna come back in, sever those fibers. It's a lot easier to take the time to make sure it doesn't chip out in the first place than it is to fix the chip out later. Ebony, the chip out will hide fairly easily, but it also chips worse than anything else does. Really wants to lift those pieces up.
Be careful.
I might have to patch that up a little bit later, because that was really biting into that ebony.
Alright.
Real quick before I pull out the rest of these, I just want to mention, if you don't have this black super glue that StuMax sells, or the Starbond sells also, go get some, because it is just an indispensable tool at this point. I couldn't live without it. And right now, since there's these little itty bitty chips I gotta glue down anyway, might as well use a little bit of the black super glue to fill in any tiny little spots where the ebony just chipped out. You can accomplish the same thing with clear super glue and ebony dust, but it takes a lot of time. And you know, I got a lot more of these frets to pull out, so any way I can save time is alright by me. So you can see, put all that glue on there, and whether it chips out or not, I put that little bit of glue because it might have started to pull on that fibers and I just couldn't see it. So putting that bit of glue in there just reinforces all of that. And I also went over the inlays, and just around those V's I did a bead of glue, because they're holding in place now, but once I sand this back I might break loose some glue or something and those might start popping back up. So I just did that just as an extra security measure. Alright, now I have to get this nut out, because whenever you do a refret, typically you level the fretboard, and this thing's going to be in the way anyway. And usually the frets are going to be fairly low and the new frets are going to be higher. So these slots will be too low. So again, another reason to replace the nut. And whenever I do a refret, I just go ahead and replace the nut for those reasons. So first thing I want to do, because this nut's painted in, and I did my best to get a good angle, but if you can't see very well, I apologize. But I'm going to score around the nut, and this paint's pretty much cracked right there anyway, just because it's so old. It's even just kind of flaking away as I touch it. But you just want to sever that paint line around the nut so that when you pull it out, you don't rip a chunk of the finish with it. Do the same thing on this side. And now, very carefully, because this slot is kind of deep. In fact, I might not even want to do this at all. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to do that. Normally, this isn't sitting quite so deep and you'll hit with a block and it'll crack it loose, but I don't think that's going to work here. What I'm going to do instead is pretty much the same thing I did with the frets, is just use the end nippers to pull them out. With this, I don't want to damage the fretboard or the headstock, so taping them off. And this nut is probably going to break while I take it out, but that's fine because we're replacing it. So I just want to lightly grip. If I squeeze this, it's just going to chip it and rip it apart, and it's going to be a real bad time. But I just want to pull on it and just kind of wiggle it around. There it goes. Just double checking there's nothing that's ripping apart on. I'll give it another score on the bottom. It wants to come out. Yep. Oh, we broke a little piece off. Not a problem. I'm actually going to take a little tiny bit of solvent just on a blade so I have control over it and I don't let it run on the finish, and just let that run down in there. That'll help to loosen up any glue that might be hindering us getting this nut out. So it's broken loose on this side, but there's something holding it here. Okay, I'm gonna try something a little risky. Put a little bit of solvent down the side here.
That's the try. Might be more bluish. That might be all we need.
Nope. Still doesn't want to come out. Guess we'll just keep pulling. See if we can get it to wiggle free. There we go. Ha! Yeah, somebody used way too much glue on that. This is a freaking mess. Oh, what the hell? That looks like paint. A bunch of paint just flowed underneath there. That's why I didn't want to come out. Gross. Got all chipped up pulling it out, but that's fine. Just needed it out of there. Garbage nut now. Alright, I'm getting ready to level the fretboard here, and one important thing to note is that this guitar has a single action truss rod, which means you can only tighten it and create back bow. There's no way to loosen it and add forward bow into it in the event that you need to. So the way to work around that is, right now there's a little bit of relief right here, and the truss rod is in its zero position, meaning it's just starting to catch on the rod right there. And so what I want is to tighten this until I have a very slight hump in the middle of the board, and right there is probably enough. There's super glue and stuff on this fretboard, but I can still kind of tell, and this is just wobbling a little bit, so it's just slightly like this, and that's what I want, so that when I level this, now when the neck is under tension, there'll be some built-in relief, and that gives me a little extra adjustment with the truss rod since it's only a single action. Now, when I do this, I use a radius beam. This one is from Philadelphia Luthier Tools, and it's 20 inches long instead of the 18 inches like you get from the StewMac ones, and it costs about half as much. So if you can, go there, you'll save a lot of money and get a longer beam. But I like these because, as you can see, it's longer than the fretboard, so that ensures that this is going to be nice and straight along its length, and that's very important to a good, comfortable playing fret job. And I just find it much easier to get it nice and flat and consistent with one of these long beams instead of one of these shorter radius blocks. I have this one taped up just to use as a clamping call. I don't really use these for sanding anymore, but they're a lot cheaper, so if you only need to do this one time, you might want to use one of these, but just keep in mind that you're gonna have to work a little bit harder and try to sand a little more even in order to get it flat with this. If you're doing this for the first time, it's really hard to use one of these, but it's a lot cheaper, so you decide what's best. I'm using the radius beam because I do a number of fret jobs. I make guitars too, and it just makes sense for me. And that's a helicopter flying overhead. Sorry, my shop's outside, so it's kind of loud. I'm just gonna go ahead and start sanding this. And one thing you really need to do is make sure that you keep this as centered as possible. If you lean one way or the other, you end up with an inconsistent radius. You'll make it more round, and that's just not good. If you do something like this, where you're kind of going like that, you'll end up twisting the fretboard, so it'll be tilted this way towards the nut side and then tilted that way towards the body side, and you definitely don't want that. So you want to keep this centered, and I have this caul that the neck is sitting in is the same width as this, so I can use that as a reference with my thumbs and my fingers to make sure that I'm keeping it centered. And it also helps to keep your arm in line with the way that you're sanding, and to just bend from the elbow. And you can keep this other hand on here too to stop it from swaying back and forth. And this certainly takes a bit of practice, but once you get it down, it works pretty well. If you're doing this for the first time, just take your time. Expect to take at least an hour to do this. It takes time to do it right. It takes time to develop a feel so that you can do it quicker. So I can do it a little quicker because I've done it a lot, but your results may vary. And I'm starting with 80 grit just to clean up all that super glue. And the cool thing about having the one that's, this is longer than the fretboard, so I don't have to move it very much, which means I'm less likely to slide around too. Now I can see this fretboard isn't really all that even. It was a little bit twisted, the radius wasn't all that consistent, and you can see I don't know if you can see, but I can see that right here is where I'm hitting. I'm hitting here and a little bit here. So that tells me this is a little bit twisted, but I'm gonna take care of that just by sanding. And I should be wearing a dust mask, but I'm not, so you can hear me. So I'm suffering for you. You're welcome. So with the 80 grit, I only want to go until everything's hit and that super glue is leveled off. And I still got a little bit of a ways to go, but there's shiny ebony here, scratchy ebony there, scratched ebony there, and I just got to keep going till it's all scratched up. Now, if you were going to do this with one of these blocks, I'm not actually going to sand because, you know, it's just tape, but you'd want to do something like this where you hit down here, you hit here, and then go over the whole thing. Here, here, whole thing. And that'll change. If you have a hump slightly somewhere, you want to start there and get that level down to the rest of it and then start sanding the rest of it. And that's why I say it's much more difficult to do it right with this if you're a beginner, because it takes some practice. But it's certainly doable. Still sticking with this though. I don't have a compressor, and I really need to get one because it helped a lot with this. Especially when you go to clean out the fret slots later. If you just keep sanding and sanding, you just pack that dust in there, and if you don't have compressed air, it's a pain to get out. But there are tools for that. Something else I forgot to mention, actually, I always go one radius above on the beam than the radius that I'm trying to get. So this is a 9.5 inch radius, and this beam is a 10. And the reason for that is because when you put the sandpaper on here, you make that radius ever so slightly more round. So I'm using the 10 inch radius beam, but by the time I'm done, this is going to be a 9.5 inch, and it just makes things a lot easier for later. Learn that trick from Renee at ESP. So this is where I'm at after about 5-10 minutes of sanding maybe. And before there was super glue across the entire frets, and I can just see there's a little bit left here. And you can see some low spots there. But it's about as far as I would really want to go with 80 grit. 150 grit will take out the rest of that. If I, went all the way with 80 and then went all the way with 150 and then all the way with 220, you're gonna sand away a lot more. So I'm gonna stop right here with the 80 and switch over to 150 so I don't go crazy and I don't have super deep scratches to sand out later, because 150 will clean that up no problem. 150 grit. I have a mask on now too. I don't know if you can tell, but one thing that can help if you don't have your hands developed is moving your whole body. It's a lot easier to keep the thing controlled when you move your whole body instead of your arms. Let me take a moment to check my progress, check the radius. Can't maybe see what I'm doing here, but I want to make sure that it's sanding evenly on the bass side and treble side. Sometimes you can sand more on one side and the fretboard will be lower on that side, and you know, you can compensate with that with the bridge, but you don't want to. You know, better just do it right. I'm going to check the radius too with my radius gauge, and that's perfect. That is, yeah, that's pretty much dead on. Actually a little round up here. So I need to make sure I'm staying more on center. So towards the middle, that's pretty good. Alright, so that is sanded up to 500 grit. And you can see it's a nice satin sheen. And there's a spot there, it's a little shiny, and a spot there that's a little shiny. But that's not really a problem because it's past the frets. So once I have the frets in, I can take a flat block and sand right there and there, and it won't affect the playability at all because it's not where the frets are laying.